The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry,
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide. Well, welcome to The Divide. We have with us today Dr. Josh Bowen, who is an Assyriologist, and he's about to explain what that is to people. It's like when I say, Josh, that I'm a classicist, then I have to explain what that means. You know, like I'm not an expert. Rock. I'm not an expert in ZZ Top or Mark Twain. So anyway, but you could give us, Josh, your background. We're going to be talking about biblical slavery today, and Josh has written a book on slavery, really an academic work. And for those of you that are Christians, you might be a little surprised at my initial take on the book, and then we'll see where that goes. But Josh, why don't you tell us about your background and how you came into the topic?
Yeah, absolutely. And you got to be careful using that word Assyriology, right? Because half the people listening probably just fell asleep. So you just got to be careful employing that word. Because most people will say to me, so Syriology, what is that? You're a Syriologist. Yeah, no.
You read the stars.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, my name is Joshua Bowen. I grew up a fundamentalist evangelical Christian. I currently have a cat on my lap that I'm going to put down and say hello to everybody. That's great. Okay. And
She'll be back.
So I was a Christian for about 26 years, and I pastored a church for 7 out in Virginia near Winchester. And when I started, I got a bachelor's in religion from Liberty University, very conservative school, and then I got a master's in theology from Capital Bible Seminary, which is now part of Lancaster Bible College. And I really focused in on the biblical languages as essentially like an up-and-coming philologist. And so I won a scholarship to go to Johns Hopkins University to study in their PhD program in ancient Near Eastern studies. And my first year there, I deconverted. And
were you pastoring still?
No, I had to resign because of the scholarship. It was going to be like 60 to 80 hours a week there at campus, so I couldn't do both. But yeah, I guess the timing was fortuitous. But yeah, so I became an atheist, and then sort of settled into a agnostic position, and then in 2018, after I graduated with my PhD, I came online, and philosophers in oh my goodness gracious, this cat informed me that actually what my beliefs were probably closer with an atheist position than an agnostic position. And so I don't really care an awful lot about the label, but so yeah,
so you just for clarity, you deconverted like at the beginning of your program, no?
Yeah, that's right. Okay. And like I've talked about this sort of thing quite a bit online, but I mean, it was essentially just being confronted with all of the data from the ancient Near East without having an extensive apologetics background. That's basically what did it. So I don't know if that was emboldening to people that do apologetics. I'm not really sure. It's ironic, I suppose, in that way. But so when I came online, I found myself sort of engaging primarily with fundamentalist evangelicals about the biblical text, in particular the Hebrew Bible. So my PhD is in Assyriology, which means the study of the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq. So Akkadian, Sumerian. I wrote my dissertation on a Sumerian topic. But I minored in Hebrew Bible, which in that PhD program is taking courses every semester and then taking comprehensive exams, all in Hebrew topics and archaeology and things. So I've spent a lot of time in the Hebrew Bible. But so I started off talking more about ancient Near Eastern topics and very quickly found that my audience actually really wanted me to hone in on the connections or interplay between the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible. So that's what I ended up writing on more. But yeah.
So is it your
coming online or your discussions that got you interested in slavery specifically, or were you already sort of studying that as part of your, as part of the studies of the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, and I want everybody to notice that, see, I forgot the initial question, right? And Drew had to bring me back, but very subtly, like, good job, Josh, but you forgot the main question we had. You remember that? So thank you. Yes. So there is an apologist, a fairly prominent apologist now by the name of Mike Winger, who puts out a lot of videos. I've had my still evangelical fundamentalist family members send me video links to him. As if I don't know who he is. Oh, here, this answers all your questions about the dating of the book of Daniel, Josh. Yes, thank you. I have a book out that has a chapter essentially responding to Mike Winger's position on this. But thank you.
Is he an academic at all, or no? Do you know?
No, he's a pastor of a church, I want to say out in California, but he's got, I don't know, 750,000 followers on YouTube. He's very, very prominent in the apologetics community. And so he had a video series, and a colleague of his by the name of, I don't remember his actual name, but his screen name or whatever is What Do You Meme? John McCrae, that's his name. And anyway, so people were, talking about, who's right here? Because the atheist is saying there's slavery and the apologists are saying there's not. So I said, all right, I'll spend some time working through the details of this. And so I ended up doing like a 3-part video response to the topic, to these apologists. And given my sort of academic background, it ended up being, I wanted to be responsible with it, because always I feel like my advisor from my doctoral program is somehow, looming over my shoulder, looking at everything that I write. So, that's a good
what it
thing.
does to you.
Watching every YouTube interview.
It's like, what did he say? Where's that citation from? Is that from the 40s, Josh? Nobody's going to take that one seriously. Anyway, so I ended up with somewhat detailed scripts for these videos, and they were pretty lengthy. And so I said, you know what? I'll just turn this into a book, because some people don't watch videos. They like reading books. And so it ended up being this little 200-page, did the Old Testament endorse slavery. Well, that set off, not the book itself, but I guess the fact that there was a resource that was bringing it all in one place. And so then I became known as the slavery guy, which
not a good
where I wanted to go.
That doesn't work as a bumper sticker,
No, definitely not. So, but anytime, the topic of slavery came, let's get Dr. Josh in here. So over the, a couple of years, I realized that there's a lot more that I could say about this, and I could actually bring in a lot of the primary resources into the discussion. So I wrote not volume 2, but the second edition, the expanded and revised edition, which ended up being like 700 pages. So that's sort of how this has grown. And, I've engaged with people like Paul Copan on the topic, like publicly. That's sort of where, from an academic perspective, that's where it ends up going. I gave a presentation on apologetics at my academic conference last year, but I mean, generally, my interaction is with online apologists. So,
and what then is your sort of overall, like, if you're giving a take on the Old Testament, on the Tanakh, and there's different frameworks of how to sort of understand these books. So what's sort of concisely, or your sort of take? Is this the traditional critical take sort of it? But what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah. So I mean, like, in a nutshell, I suppose, like, I'm looking at the Hebrew Bible as a compilation, in the same way that I would look at any other ancient Near Eastern text, right? So I'm not coming at the text with a religious interpretive framework. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? I think, people come at paintings with all kinds of interpretive frameworks, right? And my wife and I, before the pandemic, we were going to an Episcopalian church here in Southern Maryland. And I was teaching Sunday school as an atheist, as like an open atheist, right? And it's fine, because when you adopt the interpretive framework of the people that you're engaging with, I mean, you can come at the text in an appropriate way through that lens. But when I like, if I'm coming at it from a historical critical perspective, I'm looking at things like, the Exodus and saying, okay, did this happen as the biblical text portrayed in the narrative? And so the way to get at that is to look at things like archaeology and other outside historical sources or textual sources, and see, like, do these things seem to tie together? And if not, what does that mean, right? And so you might end up, as I do, saying, well, yeah, I mean, sure, this didn't happen the way that it says it did, but does that really matter overall? I mean, it just depends on how you're coming to the text. So if you're looking at the Hebrew Bible as a source of inspiration, or God is utilizing a story through this more mythological type of engagement with history, then yeah, I mean, God can just be demonstrating his power through this and giving you the security that, when you confront a difficult challenge in your life, God's there and he's going to take care of it no matter how dire the circumstance seems. So I don't think that's I think that's a fine interpretation. It's just being able to, I feel like my job online at this point is like Mr. Fact Checker, I guess, when it comes to the Old Testament, because it's like, okay, we have to be able to distinguish between, like, was there child sacrifice in, ancient Canaan, in the 15th century or something? Well, we can't really say much about that, right? We don't have a lot of evidence for that. So we have to factor that in when we think about things like when Joshua came into Canaan and, wiped it out. And the rationale in the text is that they were just awful, wicked, terrible people sacrificing all their kids everywhere. Is that a justifiable rationale? Well, I mean, historically, yeah, probably not, right? But at least we can't confirm that. But does that matter, right? Because if the text is being composed much later in, like, the 7th century or even later in the Joshua story, what is it really reflecting? And those are different questions. But again, ultimately, one's framework is going to drive that.
This is so fascinating to me because, I biographically, I think reading the Old Testament as a Christian was one of the things that started to cause me to really lose faith. And I have to admit, from talking to Bill, from hearing someone like you, I feel like I have a rather ignorant perspective on how to interpret these things. And yet, I think Bill would say that reading the Bible is a reasonable thing for a Christian to do and should be able to do. And yet, the more I think about this with a somewhat philosophical hat on, I think about, there are different kinds of stories. There are different kinds of, they're meant to be interpreted in different ways. And, I think there's the fundamentalist. Every jot and tittle, has to be completely.
Just for clarity, it was Jesus who said that, not the fundamentalists.
Okay. So you're saying Jesus was a fundamentalist? Because this might take this whole conversation in a different direction.
Just saying, you quoted Jesus right there. That's all.
I did actually quote Jesus there, but let's just say every word has to be literally true in the way that you might be first prone to interpret it. And I think that's the real interesting issue here. We're certainly going to get into the issue of slavery because you literally wrote the book on it, but in a broader thing, like I want this concept of how to get to the truth value, or even really understand the truth claim that the text is making, is super interesting to me. And maybe we could even talk about sort of the differences in potential ways to interpret it that are viable. I think Bill would clearly have a different way of interpreting it than I would.
Yeah, so I guess were you done?
Yeah, I was hoping you would jump in here at any moment, okay, because I'm running out of intelligent things to say.
So I'm not sure, like, if we were reading Thucydides, right? If we sat down and all three of us sat and read Thucydides, I mean, it's an ancient text, in Greek that most people think of as a history, because it describes itself as a history. But still, what does that mean? How did Thucydides understand history? What was that to him versus a guy today who sits down and writes history, a modern scholar? I mean, so those are all those are questions you would ask of any ancient text of whatever kind it is. And it's one of the things I've tried to do with Christians, fellow Christians over the years is, and also, to be fair, with atheists too, with non-believing people, where I kind of say, hey, look, sometimes you're trying to treat the Bible too differently from other texts, and you can't be prejudicial either way. And both sides kind of do this sometimes, and so it's really helpful to have studied ancient texts outside of the Bible, that are at the same period, and that's really insightful, helpful, and read some of that too. You don't have to be a scholar necessarily on everything, but I'm just reading Hammurabi's Code, one Sunday afternoon doesn't take that long. So I do think there's a lot of common ground there, and if you're doing academic work, particularly, there's a lot of amassed skills and approaches, paradigms, for trying to interpret ancient texts that apply sort of across the board, because these books are literature regardless of what else they are. They are common texts in that sense. And so I would guess that, as I'm going to say here, when we get over to the actual book, that I'm going to commend Josh's book to Christians, to read it. And I would say there's very, very little I disagree in just reading the book. And it's so I think so in that sense, I think we're doing sort of, everybody is on common ground in that way. But obviously, as a Christian, I also, as a follower of Christ, I take really seriously the way the Gospels present Jesus as himself in handling these texts, and then subsequently apostles or writers, say disciples, that how they treated the text becomes another layer that's added on for me, of how to understand them. And if I don't feel like I'm at war between those two things. That's not the way I think of it. I don't think I always understand really well, just as a pure academic matter, sometimes the texts. I'm not convinced a lot of academics understand them either, by the way. And then at the same time, I'm not convinced I always understand exactly what the apostles or the New Testament writers are doing with the Old Testament text. So, I mean, it's kind of a growing thing that you have to develop over time. If you're a Christian, right, you're supposed to be following Christ, take Christ's cue, so to speak. And like even your point about the jot and tittle, he's obviously there just talking about how the whole of the law is going to be fulfilled, right? He's not really giving a take on the nature of inspiration exactly, right? Like that's not the point of that verse, is to explain exactly what inspiration is. And I think it plays into it, but it's not. I'm just saying you just can't take that and then use it when it wasn't obviously used that way in its original context. Paul makes a more bold statement in one sense, because he talks about all of the Old Testament scriptures as saying they're God-breathed, which again is just an allusion, it seems to me, to the creation of Adam, that he was just a corpus until God breathed his life into him. And so in the same way, people who read these scriptures and believe them have God's life imparted to them. God shares his life to them through these scriptures. And that's a pretty common, it's repeated throughout the scriptures. So that's sort of my take, I guess I would say. And sometimes I find the academic stuff not very persuasive. And of course, I'm in academics. I'm just saying I hear other scholars' views, and I just think, I'm not really persuaded by that. And to be sure, sometimes it's because it rubs against the way I think the New Testament writers looked at it. Other times it's because I don't think the scholars have actually read it correctly. It's just to being honest. Yeah. So go ahead.
This what actually jumped out at me there is there even a slight tension between Paul and Jesus, because you said that Paul looked at, or said the scripture is God breathed, and while Jesus came not to change a jot or a tittle, he did sort of reinterpret some things, and even said where Moses said you can divorce your wives, that was just because of the hardness of your hearts. So maybe that's not. I mean, it's hard to see how that could be called a law if he's going to come around and say, well, that wasn't really God's law. That was a concession.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, clearly early Christians, right? There were some early Christians that went the Marcionite route, where they took sort of Christianity minus the Old Testament, more or less. So, I mean, clearly they saw a tension, right? They did. And I think it'd be pretty rare for people to say they see no tension between the Old Testament and New Testament. At the same time, I'll say this: the more you read both, I would say that there's a lot stronger things that Jesus said and the writings of the New Testament say that people sometimes just don't pay attention to. So I'm not at all convinced that there's sort of like this really clear theological divide in that sense. And of course, it doesn't seem that way in the Gospels anyway. I mean, there's no indication that I can think of that where Jesus is sort of very strongly severing, himself from the writings of Moses or the prophets and so on. It seems like it's the reverse, that he's far more found to be affirming them. However he understands them, he seems to be affirming them rather than just saying we can discount them. And a lot of the traps set for him, right, where they were trying to set a trap to try and show he was somehow severed. But it seems like there's a lot of effort made to try and show he wasn't. Again, whether they're right in the way they're understanding it is, that's a different question. But that's at least the way it's presented. By the way, Kenneth Kitchens, who's a scholar from England, I think he's emeritus now, I believe. But anyway, he was an Egyptologist, or is an Egyptologist. Maybe Josh, if he's still alive. But he wrote a book on the reliability of the Old Testament, and I think that would be a good place for a lot of Christians to start, as far as sort of someone who was, an academic who was an expert in his area, and sort of approaching the evidence from a historical position as well as a literary one. You can never separate them. Not so much a theological one, much more just a literary historical one. And I think that'd be a good place for Christians to start as to how they would think about it. You may agree with some of his stuff, disagree, but that'd be a good place to start, I think. It's a pretty big book. Take you a while to get through it.
Well, I want to get into a couple of, I found a couple of questions that Josh asks in his book about, to kind of lead us into the slavery topic. But yep. Josh, did you have anything or any thoughts you wanted to say on this, before we sort of get away from the more holistic interpretive issues?
I mean, just one thing I think as we go into this discussion to bear in mind, if anybody's ever seen the show Monk, which is about a detective who has some challenges with his phobias. One of the things that he's known for is his absolute brilliance when it comes to deductive reasoning, right? He sees things as a detective that nobody else sees, and he ties them all together very quickly. And so the sort of the way, the arc of the show, each show, is that somebody's murdered. It seems like it's John, right? And Monk comes along and says, it's Frank. And people say, Frank was in space at the time, right? It couldn't have been Frank. And he goes, it was Frank. And the whole show is showing how all the evidence is pointing to John, right? And Monk just maintains it. Nope, it's Frank, the guy that was in space. And then at the end, of course, the big reveal, somehow Frank had a rope that was able to go through the ozone, and he threw a knife down, whatever. But the point is that the viewer knows the end, right? The viewer has an interpretive approach to the story. And the interpretive approach is, I know Monk is reliable. So in fact, what makes it so exciting, what develops the show so much and makes it mean so much, is that for all the world, it seems like Monk is wrong. But we know he's right. And this is what, as I feel comfortable saying this, as an evangelical for 26 years, I knew that God was right. In the end, I knew that he was right. He was just, he was moral, he was omniscient, he was omnipotent, he was, omnibenevolent. All of the things. At the end of the show, we would all look back and say, yep, God was right. So if that is your interpretive approach, if you are beginning with that arc, knowing the arc and trusting in the reliability of the protagonist, which in this case is God, then all of the things that you see in the Bible, be it genocide, be it slavery, be it whatever it is that you see, even if it strikes your intuitions as totally wrong, and everything inside of you is screaming, no, that can't be, it doesn't matter, right? Because in the end, you trust the protagonist. And I think that's okay, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. What I'm going to ask, though, as we talk about slavery is nobody says, when someone comes up with a piece of evidence against John, nobody says you must have fabricated that, or that's not a real knife, or whatever. That's all real evidence that's coming against John. It's just we know that in the end, it's going to be explained by the model, the interpretive model that Monk is going to bring at the end. So we don't deny that this thing happened, that John did. We don't deny that John was in this place at this time. It's just going to be explained why it happened that way. And I would ask us to do the same thing with slavery. Let's not say, no, slavery didn't happen. Instead, let's take the evidence as it stands and say, yeah, they had slavery. It's just in the end, God is going to be shown to be right for how he did it. That's what I would say to this.
Yeah, I think this is really good. It's really helpful to put it that way, actually, I think. And I think it's, for one, because it's true. Like, this is exactly what someone like me is going to do. I do think on the other side, there's often a faith in the opposite framework. Sometimes people are convinced God's always wrong. Of course. So there's they do the opposite side of it. Yeah. And to your point, like, that's why you have to just and just to be clear for everybody, again, listening, I really, there's just very little I would disagree with. That is certainly nothing that was major, other than maybe the way in which Josh phrases the conclusion. So I want to talk about that. But I still, I think I pretty much agreed with the book, and I would be very curious as to why someone would disagree with basically the analysis of the book. And the second half of the book, by the way, is debunking common apologetic answers from Christians about slavery in the Bible, and Josh sort of shows why those don't work. And I think I agreed with every one of his refutations of these common answers. So I just say that so that as Christians realize, I think it would be truly helpful. Even though I still think I'll have some other things to say, but I commend it at that level for the very reason you're saying, because you have to start with the basic sort of facts.
Yeah, and that approach, the analogy with Monk and that approach to the facts, is something that I fully expected Bill to agree with, and I agree. I mean, it's something we can certainly all agree on, and I think it's a great way to get into the issue, because that not to make it all about our podcast or anything, but that is something that I feel like we have wrestled with throughout our friendship. Is we will agree on most of the facts, if not all of the facts, and then there's a decision point at the end where Bill will go one way and I'll go the other way. To me, that's fascinating. And some of these issues. I mean, I was with everything you said, Josh, and then when you said, at the end, we agree on these facts, and then it's all going to be, if you want to believe in God, you believe that he's going to sort of set it right, or I forget the exact wording you use, but it's all going to make sense in the end, right? And that's the part where I sort of get off the train, I guess, and I assume you do too, since you would not describe yourself as a believer. If we could, to get into the issue, I found in
Wait, hey Drew, before you go into that, can I just say one more thing? Just because I want to make sure, because I know Christians will, who will be like, wait, that's all you got to say, Bill, about that? So I just want to clarify something, which you guys, I don't think you'll disagree with this at all, but I just want to clarify. The reason that Christians will say in their own mind to themselves, in while they're sort of in their privacy, let's just say, where it's just them and their own conscience, the reason they'll have a confidence about sort of it'll all work out in the end, or it'll all make sense in the end, kind of a thing, is that is because of the cross, because the way they understand the cross is that the Son of God is God in the flesh who died for humanity. So why would they doubt that God in the end has the best interest in humanity in mind? That's like the central event of the whole story. That's where the trust is rooted, I'll just say. And and even I've always been struck by the John the Baptizer story, which often is kind of sugar coated sometimes in churches, where John has been thrown into prison by Herod, and he clearly expects that Jesus could do something to get him out, and he's stuck in prison. And so he sends some of his disciples to Jesus to say, what's up? Like, are you really the coming one or not?
Do we look another?
I mean, this is I mean, it reaches, it meets what they call the criterion of embarrassment. Joel Marcus from Duke holds that this story is original. I think it's got good reasons he does have good reasons to think it's original. Because why would they include this? Because it's John the Baptist, saying he's doubting whether Jesus is actually the Messiah. That's what it seems like on its face anyway. And then the answer Jesus gives is not like this explanation, like defending exactly what he's doing. All he does is he goes and heals a bunch of people. He raises someone from the dead. He basically, right then, we're told anyway, in Matthew and Luke, that he does a bunch of deliverance miracles. And then he says, go tell John, and then he quotes some lines from Isaiah. And so what's John supposed to take from that? I mean, just at the level of the evangelist writing the story, it's Jesus saying, I'm not going to explain why I'm leaving you in prison, but I could deliver you. And I'm delivering other people in ways that are different from just getting people out of prison. And you're going to have to trust me. I mean, that's the story. And I think for Christians, that's kind of what they end up doing. They do what sort of John the Baptist was doing there. Anyway, so let's go on now, Drew, to what you were going to say.
Yeah. And that and going back to the framework that Josh laid out, I mean, that's the way that you want a Christian to react to this. That's to me the respectable take, is to say, like, I don't really understand maybe this, but I'm going to assume what I know about God is that he will set it right in the end, and that's what I call faith. And that is different from saying, oh no, there was no slavery in the Bible. It's like,
or that it was so different it was easy.
You don't have to change the facts or make it seem like, oh, you don't need faith because this is all ironclad. So I think that's a really good way to. So anyway, where I wanted to go with this, Josh had several very good questions, sort of framing what he wanted people to get out of his book, and I don't want. There's like 5 or 6 of them, but the last 2 to me were maybe where we would want to revolve today, and was slavery condemned, condoned, or endorsed in the laws of the Old Testament? And then the last question is, would slavery found in the Old Testament be considered moral today? Those were the 2 that I thought we could probably jump right into.
Yeah,
here.
That's good. Let's do the second one first, and then get to sort of like the conclusion one. Let's cover that secondarily.
Then we can get more into the nitty-gritty of the laws. But as far as, I mean, I think we've kind of been talking around this, but I mean, I think we would all agree that, there was slavery in the Old Testament, and it was morally, reprehensible in some ways. I mean, that would be, I would say that fairly unequivocally, and just allow either of you 2 to jump in and correct me if I'm
I agree
overstating
with that,
the issue.
Yeah, I think I would just say I agree with that. But Josh, why don't you just differentiate for people who are listening the 2 sort of common forms of slavery, so people get that into their heads?
Yeah, definitely. So usually when this topic comes up for me, the thing that I hear from Christian apologists who are actively trying to like downplay the reality of slavery is it's more like indentured servitude, right? And first of all, that always strikes me as strange, right? Because indentured servitude's bad. So sick flex, bruh, right? That's what I always think. But there are basically 2 main types of slavery that you see in the ancient Near East in general, and these show through in the Hebrew Bible in ancient Israel: debt slavery and chattel slavery. So debt slavery, there's also like a famine slavery, and so you could differentiate that. But I mean, like, essentially, one is in a situation where you're lacking in some way, and so slavery results from that lack. And the big indicator that one is in this type of debt slavery, famine slavery, whatever, is that at a certain point one will get out. That's the idea. It's anticipated the person will get out and go back to their free status, whatever that means, free. Whereas chattel slavery is you're essentially property, right? There is an indefinite nature to the slavery, the status of slavery. So with a debt slave, often what you see is that someone takes out a loan, they can't repay that loan, and often contractually, the document that they've signed or agreed to or whatever stipulates that if after a certain period of time that loan is not repaid, the creditor or the person that's making the loan can recoup their losses through taking that individual that took the loan as a temporary slave. And so that slave has a different status generally in the ancient world than someone who is owned as outright property, right? They have to be treated better. They're not alienable, so usually like they can't be sold to somebody else. They don't become like a bargaining like an asset in that sense, that they can just be sold off to somebody else.
And for clarity,
now,
just for clarity for everybody, you're saying this is across the ancient world,
that's
not
right.
just in but also
Right.
in the Old Testament,
but also in the Old Testament, yeah. And so that type of debt slavery, the law often set limits. So in the laws of Hammurabi, a person can only be taken as a debt slave for 3 years. They have to be released in the 4th. In the Hebrew Bible, they're allowed to be kept for 6, and they're released in the 7th. But the
do
point
you understand
is
those as fixed, a fixed period? Because it kind of, I'm just curious how you understand it, because it's hard to tell sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah,
It seems like
I
they're
think
supposed to be fixed, but
I think the application of the law is a difficult question. That's the whole point of that first chapter is like trying to wade into what are these
but
laws.
do you agree they seem like they're supposed to be fixed, like it's a fixed thing? Yeah.
I think that the way that the language, particularly as you see it in like Deuteronomy, it was like, hey, he served you for twice the amount that you would expect, right? So I mean, you sort of see that if 6 years, you see elsewhere 3 years, twice the amount. So I mean, like, it does seem like there's something to that.
Yeah. Okay.
I think what that is setting an upper limit, right? That's the logic behind this.
Yeah, because you could obviously come in later in the fixed period, at least on paper, and then you might only serve for 2 years or 1 year, and then there's ways to game that, and they have to be warned not to game it and things like that.
So but I think the big thing that people need to recognize when they look at slavery is that usually the laws for citizens, and again, this is in the ancient Near East in general, the laws for citizens tend to be more favorable than for foreigners. That's just how it worked. So you'll see this very clearly in the Hebrew Bible, right? Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 15. When it comes to slaves, it's like, these are the rules that are for Israelites, right? And of course, when you see this debate or discussion or whatever happening, the first, one of the two passages that any atheist will go to or skeptic will go to is either Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, or Exodus 21, 20 to 21. Those are the two. And the reason they go to Leviticus 25 is because it's very clear this is chattel slavery. This is permanent slavery. People are inherited, this sorts of things. But the thing to notice is that there's a general distinction between how are foreigners able to be treated and how are citizens able to be treated. Now, so debt slavery, generally temporary. Person will return ultimately to their previous status. Chattel slavery is permanent in nature, and so they become.
For the Jews, chattel slaves would be normally foreigners.
That's correct. Now, we have to be kind of careful with that because in the Covenant Code in Exodus 21, there are ways that Israelites can become permanent slaves, right? So
that's true.
The situation in Exodus 21, 2 to 6, where it talks about a debt slave who comes in, he can be converted essentially into a chattel slave, but he has to agree to it. Now, there's an element of obvious duress, from our perspective. Do you want to stay with your wife and kids or not? But nonetheless, from the law's perspective, it was a voluntary thing, right? He had to agree to that.
Okay.
But generally speaking, it's debt slavery. Sorry, go ahead.
Awesome. No, good. Really good. I think that's a really good summary. Let me ask you a question that sort of popped into my head reading the book the first time I just sort of read through it, is I thought, I would think there's some people in the atheist world, I'll call it the atheist apologetics world, that might be critical of some of the things you say in the book, because you say you really go out of your way to try and show how, from the perspective of the writers, presenting these laws in the text, these clearly are, a lot of these laws are aimed at a more humane way of treating slaves in their context. There's meaning, by more humane, I mean there's things to protect slaves, and that's an emphasis in this. And you mentioned that. And I'm not just to be clear, I'm not trying to soften the realities of slavery. I'm just saying that's something you make a point of saying. I thought you were quite honest throughout the book to point out how these would have been understood at the time. Back to Drew's question, for sure, all of us would look at this and just say, yeah, there should be no slavery. Like, it's not that hard to. I'd be concerned if someone didn't take that view. And so that's why I said let's do question number 1 first, because I think we'd just be all in agreement that if we were, quote, in charge, there wouldn't have been any slavery. Or at least we like to think if that's what would happen. I don't know. If we lived in different periods, it's hard to say what we would do. But
and just to tie up what you mentioned there, Bill, is your reading that there maybe is some evidence for biblical Hebrew texts treating slavery in some way slightly better than contemporary texts, or what? I mean, because I think that would be probably a slight, like, I think some people would latch onto that. Some Christians would latch onto that, and
well, I would say. First of all, I would say even if that's true, I would still caution my fellow Christians to not act like that somehow solves all the problems, right? But
case closed.
I would start with something more fundamental, which is, I think Josh will appreciate this, is just, was it different? First, ask whether it was different, and in what ways was it different, and then you're in a position to sort of maybe offer some sort of judgment like that, which, as we know, can be tough. But anyway, so Josh, do you see it as there's some things different? Like if a person were to just read Hammurabi's code, right, would they see, because it seems like the last time I read it, which was not recently by any means, but it seemed like one of the things that struck me was how few of the law of the codes, really did directly apply to slaves. It didn't seem like there were as many as I expected. And I don't know if you have an idea of how many, but I thought it was a rather small number that really directly related to the actual treatment of slaves. Not saying there weren't mentions of slaves here. Obviously, there are some here and there, and a couple really famous ones. But I just sort of was struck that, by contrast, I was like, man, the Pentateuch actually says quite a bit about slaves, compared to like Hammurabi's code. Is that your impression, or no?
I think it can be. Of course, I've never sat down and counted them in that sense. There are 282 laws preserved, and of course the middle section is a little clunky because of what Shoshone did to it. But I don't know that I think it can be a little misleading, because you do have the way that the laws of Hammurabi are set up, as it's like law, law. Whereas with the Hebrew Bible, you get law, some narrative, law, some
That's
narrative.
True. Yeah, it's fine. We can just move on. I just was curious. So one thing we could all start with that's different, I guess, is that, which is, I'll just call it the great paradox, which is that the first reference you have, to the law, and to at least some of the laws after the Ten Commandments are delineated in Exodus, you get right away some references to the treatment of slaves in Exodus. And this is the book of Exodus. This is the book where the entire narrative is that God is clearly displeased that the Egyptians have enslaved Israel. And when you read about the way God says they should treat slaves, just broadly speaking, it's not uncommon for God in the text, as the speaker, to refer to the fact that they had been slaves, right? So Israel's national origin story is something that obviously is different. It's unique in that sense. And the way they understand their grand liberation, out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, this phrase that keeps getting repeated is something that's at least different. And I used to call it a great paradox, because here then you would have expected when you got to the law, the giving of the law, the first thing was, and there will not be slavery, you know? So even within that book.
So I think, and this is not going to be a perfect analogy because I don't think there's univocality in the text of the Hebrew Bible. But I think on the whole, this will probably work. We would get very upset about someone being wrongfully imprisoned, but we wouldn't be upset. I mean, just speaking generally here, maybe if we have a view of the prison system is different, so I'm not taking that into account, but we wouldn't necessarily be upset with someone being imprisoned. We would just be upset with the wrong person being imprisoned.
Yeah.
And so that's not a problem with, like, it's not like we're sitting back and thinking prison is terrible. We're thinking imprisoning the wrong person is terrible, which is different. And I think that's the overarching sort of feature. So when you think about now that, again, there's not univocality, and it's not going to be a perfect example because one of the things, as you pointed out, the oppressive nature of the type of slavery is what the biblical texts seem to be really having a problem with, right? But even that, I don't think is universal across all. But anyway, the point is that the big issue, I think, in the biblical text is that Israel is God's slave, right? The Israelites are God's slaves. That's the whole point of Leviticus 25. These are my slaves. And so here, you fellow Israelites, you guys can't even treat anymore a fellow Israelite as a slave because they're mine, right? And you can't. No man could serve two masters, right? So you can't have slaves if they're my slaves. So, but I think to your point, like, I think it's clear that the laws, be they in the ancient Near East or in the Hebrew Bible, the laws are geared to protect the vulnerable. That's what they are, right? They're geared to protect the vulnerable in any given situation. Now, that's from their point of view, right? So in a particular case, the vulnerable person might not be the slave. It might be the person that purchased the slave because they're vulnerable to the slave having a defect, right? So it's going to depend on the point of view of the person making the law. But nonetheless, they have this sort of overarching, thought way that they create these laws. That is, we want to protect the vulnerable in the situation, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And so I see that as consistent throughout ancient Near Eastern laws, including those in the Hebrew Bible. So when you see Exodus 21, 20 to 21, the verses that always get thrown out, right? If a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod and they die immediately, then it needs to be punished. But if he doesn't, or if he survives a day or two, then he's not to be punished because he's his silver, his money, whatever. Of course, to our 21st century ears, as well it should, that sounds horrific. But the reality, and this is what I have to say to atheists and skeptics all the time, like, pump the brakes, right? This, as weird as this sounds, is meant to be a protection for the slave. That's the point. The point is that doesn't make it good from our perspective, but we have to make sure that we're honest about what the text is doing, because what I hear all the time is God's given them a manual on how to beat their slaves and get away with it. No, like, beat their slaves within an inch of their life is what I always hear, and get away with it. But that's not the point of the law. The opposite is the case. The law is trying to say, yes, we know you're going to beat your slaves. In fact, in the Proverbs, that is an encouraged thing to do.
And their children. And their children. Yeah.
And their children. That's exactly right. But it's intended to be for a specific purpose of, like, moderate correction, right?
Yeah.
Is that bad? I think so. From my 21st century perspective, I would not do that. But that doesn't mean that I can import my moral system onto them and then say what horrible people they were. Like, I'm not an ethicist, but that's not how I would do that.
And I suppose if you were a slave, even though you don't want to be a slave, knowing that if they knock your tooth out, you get emancipated, would at least be, I'd prefer that.
That's right. That's right.
Right? They knock my tooth out, I get freed. Yeah. So, like,
I feel like I should at least interject. I mean, as an armchair ethicist, if that's a thing, I do want to inject my morality and just say, like, I understand where the atheist might be coming from, just to say, yeah, your book, Josh, is a very good check on the inclination to overplay what this text might mean from a God said you could beat them within an inch of their life. You would say, no, that's not the correct reading. And yet I am sympathetic to the idea that, like, it's not just that. I guess I'm not postmodern enough to say that, like, we can interpret this in our day in a different way than the morality would have affected the people of that day. Because I feel like the morality, to me, is what it is. And again, armchair ethicist at best. But I don't want us to, gloss over the fact that in an answer to your last question, I mean, to would slavery found in the Old Testament be considered moral today? I think the answer is still heck no. And I think you're just making sure to check the, you know, there's no reason to exaggerate it, right? There's no, if for an atheist, or for a skeptic, or for somebody who's saying, hey, I answer no to Josh's question, you don't have to exaggerate it. You can just take it, let's just look at the facts as they are. So, I didn't want to, I'm not disagreeing with anything anybody said. I just wanted to bring out that point because somebody might be hearing it differently.
Let me see if I can tell an experience that's becoming more common, which is scary to me, in my interactions online. I spend a fair amount of time on the app Clubhouse, sometimes on the the app Discord, usually just listening in, but sometimes I'll talk. And one of the things that's happening more frequently now, which is always a surprise to me when it happens, is that people will say, so as we're doing here, like, so what was slavery like? And I'll sort of lay it out and say, yeah, this is what slavery was like. And I always anticipate that the apologist, right, particularly the more fundamentalist evangelical apologist, is going to look at that and say, good grief, it's, I need to rethink how I'm like using this text. It's becoming far more common now, though, for them to go, good grief, maybe slavery's not so bad. Which, I go,
It's not where you were going with that.
let me just slowly back away, like Homer through the hedge, right? That's what I'm doing. Because that's where I have my issue. If I read through the Epic of Gilgamesh, my focus is not going to be to say, man, what a horribly immoral thing Gilgamesh and Enkidu did by killing Huwawa. Man, that is just, or Humbaba. Man, that's really terrible, because Humbaba's like begging for his life at one point, and they just killed him. And man, how immoral is that, right? That's not how I'm going to take that text. And I doubt many people are going to take the text that way. Instead, their intuitions are going to go, yeah, that was bad, but there's a bigger point being made here through that, right? They don't struggle with the morality of that event, but it's because they're not viewing it as a sacred text upon which they're going to build their own ethical system. And that's where I have the problem when it comes to the biblical text, is because I think if you're going to, through certain interpretive models, go back and sort of slavishly do a one-to-one correspondence of, okay, what does the Old Testament law say about this? Okay, that's what I think about it. That's what I'm going to do. So stoning children for doing this, well, that's what we need to do. It's that one-to-one correspondence sort of mindset that I'm wrestling against. And so absolutely, I would say that if we were going to take it out of slavery for a second, if we were going to go back to Deuteronomy 22 and try to determine how we should treat brides on their wedding night based on whether they can their parents can produce a bloody sheet or not, like, please, let's not do that, right? Because that's for any number of reasons utter nonsense, right? But from their perspective, if we're stepping back into what did they know, what was their scientific development, what did they know about the anatomy, all of these things, what were their assumptions, how did they determine whether someone is guilty or not? Like, these are all different things that I think have to play into the overall context and how we then approach that ancient group of people. And do we condemn them based on their own understanding? Like, that's different from condemning the behavior or the the practice itself based on our modern understanding and context. And I think those are things that we have to hold as distinct. I don't know. Did that make sense? I feel like I rambled.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
I think essentially you're saying that the tension for the Christian is really in the end, do they see that Jesus can be joined with the Old Testament or not? Because for most people, I'll just say generically, they probably view Jesus' morality as an overall positive, that it's not been terrible for the world, to say the least. And so the only question is the Old Testament need to be severed from that, or is there, because Jesus clearly didn't seem to, at least the way he's presented. So that's really going to be the debate, as far as I can tell. What you're trying to say for the Christian is whether that's doable or not. I think it is, but I'm just saying that's really sort of where the tension is going to be. Can I say something back about what Josh, you said quite a while ago, but I really want to come back to it, because you said the reason God gave, for why the Egyptians couldn't keep the Israelites as slaves is because they were God's slaves, which of course is true. Like this, he says this. And I suppose there's two things to say that just popped into my head that would be important as far as differentiating again these texts, which is one that, as you know, the word slave in English is always pejorative. There's no other, I don't know of a context where it's not pejorative, whereas in Hebrew, the word for slave actually can be used quite honorably. Most people can proudly declare themselves to be a quote slave, although again, when they do that, they're not saying it quite like the way it's a different meaning there from just being like a chattel slave. So I'm just trying to make the point, not really arguing that there is a difference there, that maybe if someone in English listening to you say that wouldn't really pick up on. And the second thing is that actually what God said to Pharaoh, the message to Pharaoh wasn't, hey, Israel's my slave, I get to take Israel out. His message was Israel is my son. And then, yes, he will come serve me. But the reason I say that is because that's a really important term, right? That in Genesis, God didn't create slaves. He didn't create humans as slaves. He created humans as offspring, as his sons, and humans have this very high honor in the narrative, of God incorporating them into his government over creation. And it's this, and I say that because that seems like it's sort of obvious that the humans weren't created as slaves. That wasn't what God's purpose was for them. It was for them to be sons. And obviously anyone in the ancient world would be able to differentiate sons from slaves. Very big difference. So anyway, I'm just saying that's a difference. That's all. Not really drawing a ton right from that at the moment, other than just to say that would be a difference. What were you going to say then, Drew?
Well, not to jump around too much, but going back to what Josh was just saying about, other laws that you would not want to be taken, or that you would not want to be read as prescriptive for our modern context to take, from the Bible. I mean, I think you have to be very careful with anything that you take from the Old Testament, and I think that's a really, Josh, when you're talking, I know you're honest, because sometimes I'm like, heck yeah, tell them, and then sometimes I'm like, oh, wait a minute, are you saying it's, and
quiet, Josh?
Yeah, and so, but I do think that that's a really interesting, and Bill, we've talked about this before, but I just find the Bible, New Testament too, just extremely hard to just read and then apply to your life, for the well-meaning Christian. And I think this goes back to something we talked about. It may have been before we hit record, but the idea of, what are you bringing to your interpretation? Are you saying, here's my morality, slavery is wrong, and then you read it and then you say, oh crap, how do I make this fit? Or are you taking the Old Testament as prescriptive for your life today? And I think even most Christians would say, not entirely. I'm not entirely just saying everything that there's got to be some way to interpret this prescriptively. But Bill, maybe there is some way. I don't know. You maybe you can speak to that. I don't know.
I mean, go ahead, Josh. You want to say something?
I was just going to say, because I think there's a really good example, because Bill, you said something that I think was absolutely spot on. and that is like the message of Jesus. I think you said like on the whole, right? And
Try not to
one of the
overstate it.
things, one of the things that I notice time and again is that it's very common with someone who hasn't been online engaging in debates and stuff like that. When you say something like the Bible endorsed slavery in the Old Testament, like they're taken aback. Like, what? What are you talking about? I think there's a reason for that. It's not because they haven't read their Bible. It's not because they're ignorant of the text or something like that. I put a tweet up, and I love telling the story, but I put a tweet up, just being a little cheeky, as I do that sometimes. And I wrote, a man went into, I'm trying to think of exactly how I worded it, went into a place of worship and through a suicide act, brought down the building, killing 3,000 men and women. And then I entered down and I wrote, his name was Samson, Judges 16:25. And of course, that sparked an awful lot of responses from people. But the point is that we don't think about Samson as a terrorist, right? And the reason we don't think about Samson as a terrorist is not because we haven't read the Samson story. Like everybody knows the Samson story. It's just nobody thinks about him as the world's first suicide bomber, right? Or whatever. Nobody does that generally. But it's because we're coming to the story and we're reading it as it stands. And when we read it as it stands in its context, Samson's the hero, right? Sure, he has these moral problems. Sure, he goes back and forth and he has these failings, but he's Yahweh. So he's a judge, right? He's the one that Yahweh picks and Yahweh empowers. He's the one that you want to meet when you get to heaven, right? Because you would be like, I want to meet Samson. He's so cool. But the problem is that we're reading it through an interpretive lens. And so when you point that out, it's jarring. And it's jarring because not that you don't know the story, but you've never thought about it from that perspective. Because the Philistines are bad in the story. Obviously, they have to be, like, they're the enemy. Of course. So you just don't see it that way. And so I think this is the case, is that when you read the Bible, including stories like Samson, like there's a reason that he can be included in Hebrews 11 and like the heroes of the faith, because that's what the narrative is ultimately driving at, right? And so I think that from this overarching interpretive perspective, that the text wants you to read it like through that perspective. That's why people walk away with the feeling that they do, that because Jesus uses it throughout the book of Luke. Jesus uses slavery as a metaphor, right? Or as an analogy all the time. He assumes it to be the case.
And through all the letters of the New Testament, practically.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And the reason that doesn't stand out, and that's not the thing that people like walk away thinking we should have slaves, right? You don't walk away from Jesus thinking that. It's because the narrative is constructed in such a way that those things are an underlying reality that are utilized to give a different message, right? And I think that can be very problematic. And so when you read people like Ronald Charles, who talk about, the body, the slave as just a body, or Jennifer Glancy, like they're pointing out these things because the reader doesn't see them unless they put on a different set of lenses and read it through that lens. And so, yeah, I think that's an important thing to pay attention to.
Obviously, they're free. They're also free slaves, meaning free in the sense that they chose to be slaves.
Sure.
Meaning in the context of the New Testament, they're choosing to follow. So real quick, the couple things that you were asking, if I just may respond to them, that one is the complexity issue. Like obviously there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of books to read. I mean, so in one sense, there's a lot to work through. So that's kind of obvious. But the other side of it is the Gospels, where the central figure is for the Christian. Even Jesus tried to make things seemingly as simple as he could, where he said, hey, the law is all summed up in this one command: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So if nothing else, a Christian could at least arm themselves with that as, to love their neighbor, love their enemies, and so love God. So even Jesus, did try to simplify things so that you could sort of have some sort of yardstick to work with that's not that complex. So that's one thing.
You didn't want to say rule of thumb in this context.
Rule of thumb, there you go. The other thing is that I think if you remember in Romans 6, Paul says emphatically, you're not under law, but you're under grace. So the theological position is that we're under a new covenant, right? The law was part of the old covenant. So Christians understand that Jesus inaugurated a new covenant. They're not under the law anymore. And he says things like in John, a new commandment I give you, right? This new commandment is like the old one, but it's a new commandment. So I think as far as the idea of prescription, I don't think that's that complex either. Christians aren't under that covenant. They're not under the law, and they don't view it, at least they shouldn't view it that way. Now, they may view that there's lots of valuable principles and lessons and things about God and the way he's governed across history, but that's different from being like under the command that I have to do this, and if I don't do this, there's a punishment and so on. If the Jews didn't follow the law, then God warned them, you'll be judged. You'll eventually be back enslaved again and so on if they didn't follow the law. So Christians obviously don't, I take that to be kind of sort of like the standard theological position of the New Testament. And then what else was there? Oh, I think that was it to your questions, Drew. I have another. Go ahead, Drew. You're gonna say?
No, I think that's probably an improvement on just anyone who would be tempted to not see the distinction there between the covenants. I mean, I guess there's some tension there when the New Testament says that the old covenant will be fulfilled in the new one. It's a little bit. I don't think that would make anybody not wear clothes made of two fabrics or what. Like I don't think that everything is that any Christian would read the Bible that way. But I do think that even the new covenant, for instance, not necessarily spelled out in every I think what I always remember that the sort of the wiser Christians that I learned from as a youth would say things like, well, not every issue is addressed in Scripture, and we have to bring our own judgment to bear and let the Spirit lead us and all that kind of stuff. And I think that makes more sense than trying to read the Bible 100% prescriptively for everything that we would want to do morally correct.
Well, Josh actually pointed out that actually there are Christians who might want slavery again. I mean, I don't know that I know any, but I'm just saying that the reality is that some people do. I consider that irresponsible, but I'm just saying there obviously are some people who they don't
so much say yay slavery that I've heard, but they say, oh, well, then it's not that bad, as Josh was alluding to, or if it's debt slavery, or if it's like there's often some moments on podcasts where you can hear a pin drop when Josh or someone else will say, oh, would you like to become my indentured servant then?
I was just
not putting those words in your mouth, Josh, but certainly if somebody asks the question, no one's saying yes to that.
Who would? I was going to say I would kind of feel like
it's
a kind of form of hypocrisy to me for someone to say, slavery's not that bad then, I guess, because who's going to want to be a slave? Like, nobody wants to be a slave. It'd be dishonest with themselves if they thought slavery was okay. This seems kind of ridiculous to me, but do you guys want to go on then to by the way, I was going to say the idea of Israel being, well, no, this relates really to the last question. So let's get on to the question about endorsing. I think, right, that's what you said, Drew. It was the last question.
Yeah, so the question Josh had in the book was slavery condemned, condoned, or endorsed in the laws of the Old Testament? And we've already bounced around that quite a bit.
But why don't we let Josh tell us what his conclusion was?
Yeah, that's probably better.
Yeah, there's a reason that I'm sort of specific about the terminology that I use, and given that as in any language, words can take on different meanings in different contexts, I try to define the terms as I'm using them. So from the three choices, condemn, condone, or endorse, condemn, obviously, I think everybody agrees on. Condone, I'm using in the sense of to say, we understand that it's morally wrong, but we're going to allow it for X reason. And then endorse, I'm using in the sense of, more of a neutral position that, yes, you can do this. It's almost like sanction, right?
Or even prescribe.
Yeah. And so I want to be careful about how I say that, because I don't know of any law that says thou shalt own a slave, right? Anywhere in the ancient Near East, including the Hebrew Bible. So it's not like, in other words, it's not a positive law where you say you have to do this, like you have to observe the Sabbath. There is no, you have to own a slave, or you're going to be in trouble. Those of you that don't own slaves, boy, I'm going to come visit, destruction upon you. It's not that kind of law. If you want to, you can, right? If you want to get married, you can. Here's how you do it. So it's more in that category. And so what I think is very clear, sort of going the other direction, is I don't see it as being condemned. I think pretty clearly, I don't see it as being condemned. In other words, in the same way that you shall not murder, you shall not rape, or any of those things. I don't think it's being condoned, although I think that from an apologetic standpoint, I think that's the strongest case to be made. Is sort of like is it, I always forget Webb's first name. I think it's David Webb, but it's probably not right. But he's got a book out, and the name is escaping me, as well as it always does. But he's essentially doing a sort of a Matthew 19 approach, right? That I talk about in the book, where it's sort of akin to divorce, right? Yep, I allowed that because of the hardness of your hearts. So I allowed slavery because of the hardness of your hearts, but I'm slowly working you guys out of that. I think there are problems with that.
So to be clear, condone in that sense, you mean not the meaning which often is sort of like tacit approval, but more like it's tolerated or overlooked.
That's
or
right.
Something like that.
Allowed,
that's right. I don't like it. It's immoral, but given my stated goals or my unstated goals, I'm going to allow this to continue in order to bring about a better end. Right. And the example that I think a friend of mine gives quite often is like, if I'm terrible with drugs, so please forgive me. But like if somebody's on meth and they're trying to get off of meth, they'll take methadone. Is that correct? I think that's correct. Anyway, they'll take something that is...
Sounds plausible.
We don't want them taking methadone, but if it gets them off of the actual drug for a period of time, I will allow that to be the case, because if I just cut them off, they're going to go right back to it or have very terrible adverse effects.
Chemotherapy.
Yeah.
Similar.
Yeah, that's a good example. And so I like the methadone one only because I think everybody would say, we think methadone is like, if just somebody just started using methadone for no reason, we would say that's bad, right? Don't do that.
Yeah,
and I guess that's true for chemotherapy as well, right? But
I generally don't recommend it to my friends or family. Yeah,
right. Yeah. It's not a Christmas present you're buying people.
Yeah.
But it's something that you will, tolerate or allow or something for the greater good, right? Okay. Again, I think the strongest case for why God would have laws about slavery in the Hebrew Bible, I think that's the strongest case to be made. Again, I don't agree with it, but I think it's the strongest case. What I think is that the Hebrew Bible is doing what the rest of the ancient Near East was doing, and that is putting laws in that are attempting to benefit the vulnerable person in the situation, which in this case, these laws would be the slave. In doing so from the perspective of, we want to protect the weak, we want to protect the vulnerable. And again, this was just sort of standard across the board. This is what good kings did in the ancient Near East. So
the national origin story is just sort of juicing it.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. Right? It's there's a story. It's probably my favorite ancient Near Eastern story, and it's called "The Poor Man of Nippur," and it's about a guy that in the beginning is like totally down on his luck. Right? He lives in the city of Nippur, and he's got like basically nothing but like a little goat, or a little lamb. I think it's a goat, but that's it. And he says, "All right, I can either eat this thing and then die, right?" Or I can go to the mayor who's supposed to take care of me. He's in charge. He's supposed to be looking out for me as the vulnerable person. And so he goes and he says, I'll give the goat to the mayor, and in return, the mayor's really going to take care of me. Right. And the mayor does the exact opposite, right? He like gives him third-rate beer and third-rate like meat, and then has him thrown out. And that's how the story begins. So that it's a whole story about taking revenge out on the mayor. But the point is that the reason that rings true to the reader is that they go, why would the mayor do such a thing? Because he's supposed to be looking out for the vulnerable. And so I think that's what the laws are doing. They're attempting to look out for the vulnerable with the assumption that, of course, you have slavery. Like, of course, in the same way that, of course, you're going to beat your children. Of course, you're going to do that. So that's my position on what the Hebrew Bible is doing.
I think this is where probably, we'll part ways. But it's important to kind of understand where I'm coming from. I certainly probably in the end am just in your like best argument you can make, but I don't agree with it position. I think in the end that's probably the gist of it. But I would just maybe approach it a little bit differently in that, because just like, let's say we were talking about Star Wars and we said, well, what does the Force do? Or what is the Force and what does it do? Like presuming there's some unity there, across the all nine, we would be able to say things. And if someone came along and said, well, no, this is what the Force did, like the three of us might say, this person hasn't watched the movies very carefully, like they just are saying something that's just not right to what the Force actually does or whatever. So I feel like for me, we can do that with Scripture. And of course, I see a unity, so I'm guaranteeing that as an a priori thing. But I also see it practically. Like it's not just my a priori decision. I actually see it worked out and whatever. So that I think you have to assume that. But even if we just isolated a book like Genesis or Exodus or something, I still think we can sort of see this. But so here's what my approach would be like, well, what's God's actually like? What's his will? What were his purposes? That kind of a thing, right? I'm a Christian, so I'm going to be concerned about that. And I think we can discern that to at least some extent of like what God's view of humanity was. But let's just say I start as a Christian. I just start with the cross. I always think of the cross as crosshairs, like it orients you vertically and horizontally. So I said this earlier in the interview, kind of a thing, that Christians going to start this way. Like they really believe Jesus was God in the flesh. This is what God thinks of the world, that every human being, every single one, he died for them. Like he loves them. God so loved the world, he died for them. This is, a really clear, easy thing to work with. It's simple. It's an event, as well as it's got a really famous verse you can hold up behind the goalposts during NFL games. So this is what God thinks of. And then it sort of borne out in the church, like the within the church, right? In the New Testament letters there, the slaves were brothers, right? They were part of the family. They could serve as elders. They weren't like slaves in the church. Were there slave owners in the churches? Sure. Were there people who were slaves in the church? Yes. But within the church itself, within the gatherings, they were emphatically not the slaves over here in the corner. They weren't like kept from being elders or deacons or whatever. They were, brothers. There was neither slave nor free, that kind of a thing. So do I think, anyway, so that's just at least the basic sort of framework that you see come out of the cross, let's just say, using those crosshairs. And the question then is that something like a radical turn from God's will or view from these Old Testament books, and that you have to kind of go the Marcionite route or not? And I would say, no, I don't think you have to, because when God first made the world, he obviously didn't make humans as slaves. He made them as sons. And the term sons is the term of choice throughout the Gospels, throughout the epistles. You see it used by Jesus, you see it used by Paul, and so on, that Christians are described as sons of God. And the terminology is coming from the idea that the whole book of Genesis is framed around the idea of offspring. It's actually, if you didn't know, the word zerah, Josh, in Hebrew, for offspring, it's used there like 100 times more than any other book of the Old Testament. So the whole book is turning around the idea of God's offspring and their honor and where things went wrong and things like that. So you see it there, and then when you get to Exodus, So in other words, this is what God's purpose was in creation. When you get to Exodus, though, like you said, it's really because Israel is privileged that God is taking them out of slavery, right? It's not just a blanket statement about all of slavery. I agree with you about that. As far as the narrative is concerned, it's because Israel is privileged. But why are they privileged? Well, because they're God's son. So that nation was uniquely categorized as God's son, which again is not new. It's just the same framework, the same paradigm out of the earliest chapters of Genesis, that to be a son means you're not a slave and you get to serve in God's government and so on. And so I see that as sort of like, well, those are the first two books. That's the way the Creator is orchestrating history and the direction he's moving humanity. Now, that doesn't solve the question. Well, then why would he allow slavery at all? Like, why have that paradox? Like that's where to me, that's where the rub is. It's less in terms of sort of like what God's view of humanity is, and more like, why would he allow this then, which seems like it's the opposite. And it may be that there's just no answer. The Christian has no answer. There's no answer really provided. There could be, that may be all that the Christian can do. I think if I had to sort of pick one direction, it would simply be that God wanted to differentiate Israel from the rest of the nations because the path the rest of the nations were on was a path of destruction. Keep in mind, not just like eternal destruction, but self-destruction. The way Old Testament views the nations around Israel is that they're not just in darkness, but they're in a path of self-destruction. It's destruction to the world. It's destruction to what humanity is supposed to be for, and so on, in contrast to the Jewish view. I mean, that's just the general paradigm. And so I think that's all you could really say, is that God was content for the time being, that be allowed within Israel, but still differentiated in some ways. But basically, that's the best you could do. I don't find that like very satisfying personally. I just think of it as better than no purpose, but I'm not convinced that's like an answer, and I would never push it as an answer. I would just go back to the sort of the approach that I took, and then just sort of leave it as, I feel there's just going to be times where the Christian's going to feel a little bit like John the Baptizer in prison. And also what the Christian needs to realize is not just they don't understand something. They need to realize there were living people, humans, living under that. And who would want to have lived under that, Now, it's true that there were some privileges where slaves and so on could be incorporated into the Jewish culture and lifestyle and stuff. And from the biblical perspective, that's definitely an advancement on living in the other nations and so on. But again, would you want to be that slave who's living in there? And I think you should never pretend that would be great, or that wasn't a problem. Like, that would not be hard and difficult. Just as, by the way, Christians today live with cancer, or see their kids go through whatever disease that's chronic, and they live their life through it. It's the same basic problem. Is why is God tolerating this for now? But the view is, of course, within Christianity, it's temporal, and God doesn't intend to leave people like that forever. Right? I mean, that's kind of obvious. So anyway, that'd be sort of my approach.
It's an interesting analogy you make, between sort of the larger question about suffering. Why is there suffering at all, or why is there suffering of innocence, like a child, versus why was slavery allowed, if I can use the term allowed in the Old Testament, by God. I do see a slight difference there, and that one is sort of more directly codified, and one is sort of the mystery of why is the world the way it is. But
for sure.
But
yeah, that makes it worse. I think it makes it worse. It's why Jesus' answer about divorce becomes such an important passage for people like me, because he just flat out said that it wasn't God's will in the matter of divorce that it be this way, as it was allowed under the law. I mean, he just flat out says it, that it was because of the hardness of their hearts, which, whatever. By the way, that doesn't even. I always ask people, well, yeah, but what does that mean then?
Well, I appreciate your not giving a pat answer and saying, I'm perfectly comfortable with this. And I hope any Christian that's listening will take that same approach as you do and say, like, yeah, I don't know why God did this in the Old Testament, why he would allow something like this, or why he allows, a child to get cancer today or something, undeserved, seemingly.
Yeah.
I would even add, or why, uh, you know, finite sins would require infinite punishment, but that's a topic for
Yeah.
another
Yeah. Well, and
day.
there's things worse than slavery in the Old Testament too, which so I mean,
But
it
but I
doesn't end
think
there.
that's a good. I hope that we leave people at least with the question, which I think Josh's book does a good job of asking, answering, and then yet leaving room for both sides to sort of say, maybe I need to sort of look at this a little bit broader. And if we did that at all today, I'm satisfied. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah, and
appreciate.
and again, I just say to Christians that I think they should read Josh's book, and I will say it's very interesting to me that in the end it comes down to trust. I mean, we need to wrap up the conversation here and let Josh tell us a little bit about his work with Digital Hammurabi before we let him go. But it is interesting to me how much it comes down to trust, right? And it's interesting that that's precisely what the Bible emphasizes, right? Right from the story of Abraham forward, but it's very, very strong in the New Testament. It's because faith really means trust, right? In the original languages, or dependence, or confidence, or something, reliance. And it's interesting that that's really what it does come down to, is trust. But Josh, why don't you kind of close this out by telling us a little bit about your work there?
Yeah, and I if I could, because I think I wrote a chapter contribution to a book back in 21, I think 21 or 22, and it's called, the book's title is Misusing Scripture: What Are Evangelicals Doing with the Bible? And it's a Routledge publication, and my chapter is Your Eye Shall Have No Pity. It's like violence and genocide and like modern morality, evangelical modern morality, something like that. But I deal with the question of violence and genocide, and essentially like apologetic arguments against it. And one of the things that I do, you have two standard apologetic arguments against these passages, like 1 Samuel 15, 1-3, where Saul is commanded by the prophet to go and to kill everybody, men, women, children, infants, sucklings, the cattle, sheep, everybody. And one is to say that was hyperbolic, right? It was like saying, like, go slaughter the Steelers in the football game. It doesn't really mean that, right? Or they were really, really wicked and they deserved it, right? So it's usually one of those two. And what I do is one of the big things that I've taken to doing now, given my background, is I just say, let's look at other ancient Near Eastern texts that do the same thing, right? So if you go look at Sennacherib, or you go look at Tukulti-Ninurta, these Assyrian kings, and they say things like, Tukulti-Ninurta has this epic back in the 13th century where he says, I went to battle against Kashtiliash IV, the Kassite king, and he was so wicked. Boy, that Kashtiliash, he rebelled against the treaty the oath that he swore to the god Asher, my god. And boy, he swore this, and then he just went back on it. He just rebelled, and Asher was so benevolent. He was so merciful, but he just kept rebelling. And so Asher said, you got to go set this right. And in fact, in the text, Kashtiliash, the Kassite king, the bad guy, you actually have him saying, boy, I've been so sinful. I've been so bad. And the Assyrian king, boy, he's been nothing but pious and observant. And I've brought this on myself, right? Well, nobody reading that text goes, well, I guess the Kassites were really bad people, right? And the Assyrians were really great, right? And so that, like, nobody does that. And the reason that we don't do that, including the apologist that's making these arguments, is they recognize that text for what it is, right? The texts do things, and so they see that. And I think that in the end, it's not going to be an argument from the text that drives this. As you said, like Bill made the comment, I think it was very, very good. Like, it ultimately is going to come down to faith. It's ultimately going to come down to trust. It's ultimately going to, I have gained this confidence in Jesus Christ for whatever the reason might be it personal experience, be it, some interaction with the text. I don't think it's going to be some apologetic argument, but whatever. There's something that has created this position, this view that I'm going to take the text through this faith position. And when I do that, it's just going to inform the way that I read the text. And I think if we can all recognize that, then the argument, the things don't come down to, like, a person doesn't then feel the need to go back and say it wasn't real slavery, right? That's not required any longer.
Yeah.
Because the position of faith that, look, I don't understand why or how Monk is right about this in saying the guy that was in space killed. I don't have to try to, doctor the evidence against John. I don't have to do any of that stuff. I can just let it stand. Yep. But Monk said it, and I can stand on that because I believe in him.
The more cases he solves, the more.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so
about digital Hammurabi, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, Josh.
No, that's
shut it. I get it.
No.
Yeah.
I just was.
No. I'm just teasing. I do.
Want to make sure you mention
it. So my wife runs Digital Hammurabi. It's her baby, and Hammurabi. And I kind of do it in my spare time, but it's her thing. She has a scholarship that she runs, where she gives PhD students $2,000 scholarships. She usually gives 3 or 4 out a year, and students come on and give a presentation about what they're going to do with the money if they win, and then it's crowdfunded. So donors give the money online, and it's a 501c3 or 3c. I always mix those up, but it's tax
C3.
It's 3c, it's tax write-off then. So. But then they get a vote. If you donate, you get a vote who gets the money, and it helps PhD students get through the summer when they usually don't get funding. But she does that. Of course, she's the host of Bart Ehrman's podcast. If you don't know Misquoting Jesus, if the viewers don't know, but I, in my spare time, write books. So we've both written 2 books on how to learn to read ancient Sumerian, which are surprisingly our most popular books that we've written, by a factor of 2 at least. But I've written 2 atheist handbooks to the Old Testament where I deal with these types of apologetic arguments. I've written did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery. I wrote a popular version of my dissertation, all that stuff. You go into Amazon and type in Joshua Bowen, all those books will come up. But I really like pushing her work more than mine, just because Megan is a lot smarter than I am, and so I feel like she doesn't get enough credit for that. So
nice,
yeah,
great way to end the podcast, right? That's awesome, Josh. You've been really, really informative and helpful and great. And
this is
really
awesome.
We were both really looking forward to this conversation, and definitely is great. And really, I kind of feel like at the end there, you kind of teased maybe a having you back on and doing another conversation. There you go. So I feel like we have another podcast now that we can come back to. So
you were going to get the invite anyway. So.
Yeah, you were going to get it anyway. So, but
it's
anyway,
the bow tie. I get it.
Yeah, you've set the topic already. So, anyway, great to have you on. I'm Bill the Christian. Oh, I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, The Divide by iPub. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.